I'm Alan Meban and welcome to this latest episode of Slugger TV. February the 2nd was Groundhog Day, and cynics in Northern Ireland might think that our local politics every day is Groundhog Day, but I'm joined today by commentator Sarah Creighton, and I'll be asking her whether or not there are signs of change in Northern Ireland as we head round to elections, as we think about the Good Friday Agreement and its 25th anniversary and so on. So Sarah, you're very welcome to Slugger TV.
Yes, I'm here on my own today.
So this time last year, Paul Givan was standing down as First Minister. Do you see any sign in the political tea leaves that the Stormont might get restored?
I don't at this moment in time, simply because I don't see the DUP preparing their base for a climb down. So the DUP have really manoeuvred themselves into a bit of a hole when it comes to the Northern Ireland Protocol. They've got their 7 tests, which really mean no protocol at all. Even though some DUP members have started talking about a reform protocol, there has been a slight change in language, but they still seem to be looking over their shoulder to Jim Allister. And we hear talk now that the EU and the UK government are going to do a deal, that they're going to try and come to some type of arrangement. It's not clear yet whether any of them are going to meet the DUP 7 tests, and I don't think it is possible based on what they're going to agree. The protocol is still going to be there. So I don't see Stormont coming back anytime soon unless we get some sort of deal that they can accept. So I think that's pretty depressing going forward, really. But at the same time, there's so much pressure on public services, the cost of living crisis. Part of the electorate, a large chunk of the electorate, are really unhappy with the fact that we don't have Stormont at the moment. So there may well be further political pressure down the line. Events may change that the DUP may feel that they have to go back in, but I would say the majority of unionists back their position. They're looking over their shoulder at Jim Allister. I can't see them doing it.
Since the 7 tests were written probably nearly 2 years ago, they came out long before the thing collapsed. And those within the DUP who would say, they kind of tried for a long time to affect change and to kind of find the levers of change and to convince people to change the protocol while they were still in government. Do you think it's paying off for them that they've actually dropped out for a year and they eventually reached that point where they decided we can't keep trying to convince people to negotiate while we're in government? We really need to kind of drop anchor and pull out. Is that working for them strategically?
I would say, based on the polls, it seems as though it is working for them electorally. So they were behind in the polls a couple of years ago, and then they've moved more towards the Jim Allister TUV stance on the protocol, and their poll numbers have gone up. Their result in the Assembly election last year was not as bad as people predicted, even though they did have a couple of significant losses, but there wasn't anything major. So there's no pressure coming from their base, from their supporters, for them to go back in. I think their supporters and their base are quite happy with their position. Obviously, they're not flavour of the month with any of the political parties or everybody else in Northern Ireland, but it has worked out for them to take this stance in the short term. But I think what I would say in the long term, I think they're doing some very serious damage here. They're doing some serious damage to devolution. They're doing some very serious damage to Northern Ireland. They're doing very serious damage to the union, I would say, as well. There's a whole host of voters now that are going through the worst cost of living crisis ever, and they have no representative government. The DUP keeps saying, Westminster is here, Westminster is where we should be. Well, the Westminster government doesn't really seem to be doing a very good job. So I think they're going to pay for that a couple of years down the line, I would say.
In recent days, there have been stories in the papers that suggest that Rishi Sunak could do a deal over the head of the DUP. Now, that wouldn't be the first time that the Tories have kind of ignored the unionists that are part of the Conservative and Unionist kind of branding. If that was to happen, it's nearly inevitable. If the DUP haven't been consulted or aren't kind of in the room, or at least in the room behind the room, it's nearly inevitable that they wouldn't go back. So is that a sign that the Tories could cut Northern Ireland loose nearly, in terms of, at least politically, it doesn't really matter whether we've devolution or not, they'll cope either way?
I would say so. I'm pretty sure the Tories probably don't lose sleep at night about Northern Ireland and the lack of devolution here, only for the fact that it's probably an inconvenience. I would say I don't think they really want to have Northern Ireland on their in tray. I think they would rather they could just put it in the box in their heads labelled "do not pay attention to," But I think they are keen to maybe get the protocol off their plate and say, look, we have got this change, we've got reforms to it, it's much better, up to you now, do whatever you want to do. The protocol has the vote in it to do with the Assembly. We're going to have that in another 2 years' time, I think. And I mean, they can do that without the Assembly being in place, I'm told. Lawyers watching this can tell me whether that's right or wrong, but there was reading something recently where somebody said they can still do that. So yeah, I think if Rishi Sunak does do a deal, I think he will probably just be saying, well, this is what we've got, these are the reforms. If he gets his whole government to back him, up to you to decide what you want to do and let devolution go. Unless, the ERG wing of the Tory party, and you can see the articles that people are writing in the newspapers, the Daily Telegraph and things like that, that they are still a bit annoyed about the protocol. Unless Sunak suddenly listens to these Tories, I think he will just do the deal and say, right, that's you, off you go. If you want to crash the Assembly, go for it. But I think symbolically, obviously, it doesn't look good. We're coming up to the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and the Americans are very keen for a deal to be done. Sunak will have that in mind. He may want to have the American president over. He may want to have the joy and the glory of having restored devolution in Northern Ireland. But as I said, I don't think it's going to happen.
We're looking at tea leaves in cups that we don't even have to look in. But I mean, if I was the EU, I would be kind of imagining, well, is the Sunak government going to be the government in a couple of years' time? Are we heading towards the end of the Tories in Westminster, or will there be a Labour government? And I'm not quite sure, based on performance of the Labour in opposition, that's a sure bet. But they might not be in any rush to actually come to a conclusion to the talks, or at least a final conclusion to the talks. This could drag on for a lot longer than Good Friday Agreement 25th anniversary. Yeah. That's a pretty artificial deadline in some ways.
It is an artificial deadline. I don't think it's a useful deadline. If we get to the 25th anniversary and there's no Assembly, well, that says everything about what has gone on here over the past 5 to 6 years and the damage that's been done. The EU may well decide to draw this out, but I think, if the EU and the Tory government we want a deal to restore the Assembly, they're going to have a word with the DUP. The DUP need to move their red lines. The DUP need to change their position and be pragmatic, which they're not going to do, as long as they are getting support from their base, as long as their vote numbers are going up and they have the support of the majority of unionists, they're just not going to change.
Do you read anything into the fact that certainly the papers last weekend were talking about, they were kind of mentioning again that Peter Robinson is kind of in the DUP headquarters as advising again, that he's kind of, not that he was ever out of the fold, but he's a bit more actively involved. He normally comes up with kind of cute wheezes in order to make things happen. I'm not sure we're going to be getting any letters from America this time, but I mean, but there are sometimes there are schemes that they can come up with that at least give a little bit of room without them losing face to do things. I mean, do you think that's Jeffrey Donaldson trying to actually kind of get round some of the harder line figures, maybe like Edwin Poots and Sammy Wilson, who'd be a bit more kind of not going to move an inch on some of these things, whereas Jeffrey Donaldson always feels a bit more pragmatic. He may not have liked the Good Friday Agreement at the time, but he's kind of fond of devolution, I think, at his heart.
Yeah, we all know the DUP love devolution, and we all know that when devolution goes away, the DUP lose out. We saw that a couple of years ago. Every time the Assembly collapses, Westminster comes in and passes something and the DUP complain about it. And we all go, well, what did you expect? It's hard to tell, isn't it? Because the DUP are parroting the lines of Jim Allister, Jamie Bryson. They very much are sticking to their tune so far. I haven't really heard that much pragmatism from Peter Robinson so far. Peter Robinson seems to be, no, we need to push this, we need to push this. I was asked when I was on The View there a couple of months ago, do you think the DUP need to go back to Peter Robinson a couple of years ago? He said, that they need to win nationalist votes over and woo the Catholic population in Northern Ireland. I mean, I don't think they even tried that. They never got there. Yeah. Naomi Long won East Belfast and off it went to one side. So I can't see... The language has changed slightly. They are talking about different types of protocol, but I can't see where's the climb down. How are they preparing their base for that climb down unless they get some whopper of a deal that they can actually go and say, yeah, we did that and our strategy worked. And they would probably benefit very much from that at the ballot box, because the unionists would say, oh, well, there you go, the leverage worked. And this is what you did this, that you got this, even if it had nothing to do with them. But as you say, if they don't do it, we're going to be sitting here for years and years talking about the protocol.
Welcome back, viewers.
Exactly.
It's 2027 and we're still talking about the protocol. Now, we'll maybe come back and talk about the local elections that are coming up, the local government elections coming up in May in a minute. But, we should always remember that all politics tends to be about kind of keeping power and things. So I mean, I suppose what you're suggesting is that the DUP need to think about the TUV and the damage that does rather than the damage that the UUP or Alliance do to them. I mean, the real electoral, if they're going to have a fight with anybody, it's on the right wing of the party, it's on the hardline end of the party. That's where they need to be seen strong at the moment, isn't it?
I would say so. Now, I still think Alliance, they do need to keep their eye on Alliance, and I think there was some indications that some of their voters are going to Alliance, but it seems to be that their poll numbers have dropped and the TV have gained when they take certain positions. So at this point in time, if you were DUP strategic thinker, yes, you're looking, the right of the party's going, we need to watch out for the TV. We need to make sure the TV don't do to us what we did the Ulster Unionist Party, essentially. So yeah, I think that's where they need to look. But as I said, in the long term, they are doing, I think, a lot of damage to Northern Ireland, and I think they will regret taking this position.
So you said a couple of times about the kind of suggesting the DUP damaging devolution or damaging people's perception of politics and so on. Yeah. Tell us a bit more about that, because we're kind of heading towards be April, just over 2 months' time. There'll be a whole pile of events kind of marking 25 years since the kind of Good Friday Agreement was wasn't quite signed, but it was agreed and announced, and then there'll be the kind of the referendum. I'm sure we'll get another set of events for that. But you've been alive for all that time, just about. But what do you see as what's been gained and what's kind of at peril at the moment?
There's so much you could unpack from that question. As I said, I don't think that the deadline for the Good Friday Agreement really is a good deadline. I don't think it should be the case that when we get to the 25th anniversary, we go, everything's fantastic, because the Good Friday Agreement, was fantastic, and I mean, I'm very glad, the country voted for it. I think we're coming to a stage where I think a lot of people are starting to become frustrated with elements of it. Maybe not the document as a whole or the agreement as a whole, but the institutions, how they're functioning. And I think that plus the cost of living crisis, the economy is about to take a huge dip. They say the UK is about to enter a long period of stagflation. The health service has collapsed. And then we have no assembly at the same time. For some people in Northern Ireland, they're going to be thinking, what is this? What is the point of all of this? What is the point of the assembly? What is the point of devolution? And then, as I said, the DP would say, well, look to Westminster. Well, I don't think the public are very happy with Westminster either. They're furious with Westminster. I think the Tories, you can see by their poll numbers, the country really is fed up with them. Whether Labour get in, we'll just have to see the circumstances at the time. So, for a lot of people for a long time have always been told devolution is what Northern Ireland needs its own government. I'm starting to hear from people, actually, I don't really care if the Assembly doesn't come back. I don't really care. And then, you talk about the Good Friday Agreement, 25 years, some people will say, well, what have we gained after 25 years? What has this country got? The absence of violence, yes. But, there's some communities out there will say, we've got nothing out of this. Our communities are living in poverty, our young people are still disadvantaged, we don't have the jobs, education, employment. There's just so much at stake here, and I suppose my fear from that is that there's a younger generation growing up who are living through all of this, and we know from polls and statistics that these young people are most likely to be Catholic, identify as Irish. At some point, if they do call a border poll, thinking about the bigger picture here, at some point they call a border poll, and this is their experience of the Union, this is their experience of the devolution in Northern Ireland. How are you going to sell this to this younger generation coming through? It's different for people like you and I, who, as you say, have grown up maybe tail end of the Troubles, remember the Troubles, remembered Northern Ireland in a different place. They're doing massive damage, and as I said, nowadays you would hear people say things like, well, we don't have a say in our future. We don't have a say because the Assembly's gone. We don't have much of a say in Westminster, and someone's going to come along, possibly at some point, I think highly likely, and say, here's an out. And my concern is that they will take it. I mean,
if you flip it on the other side, you'll say that there are loyalist communities who would say that they've got very little out of the agreement, and perhaps one might say there's an absence of leadership, that they should be blaming political leadership in that case, because there's plenty of things that could have been done. When you control the budget, you control where the money gets spent and where uplifts can happen.
You could, but obviously political leadership is a problem. I think it's a problem for both communities in Northern Ireland. I mean, there's widespread deprivation in working class nationalist Republican communities and loyalist communities, and I suppose I don't think it entirely comes down to political leadership. Yes, obviously, I wish we had better politicians who made better decisions, but we need to talk about what has happened since the Good Friday Agreement was signed, the economic measures that have been brought in, how this economy has grown, who has got the benefit of that. The benefit of that has been going to the middle classes, not the working class communities in Northern Ireland for the most part. So, when they say, we haven't got anything, and people say, maybe you should vote for better people, you think, well, really? If you voted in better people, would this be any different? I don't think it would, especially if that political leadership is tied to the economic system that we have. It really annoys me when people sort of blame, when loyalist communities come out and say, we haven't gained anything from the agreement, and people blame them. I just think that's so unfair, completely unfair.
Around April time, the fig leaf has been kind of waved in front of politicians to say, if you get your act together, you have a working assembly. You never know. President Biden is on a European tour, it seems, about that stage. He may call in Ireland, he may call in kind of GB. He could kind of land in Belfast. And do you read into the fact that there seems to be the economic envoy, Joe Kennedy III, the young Joe Kennedy III, he's only in his 40s, that he's around kind of meeting with secretaries of state and so on. There's much more interest again publicly in Northern Ireland from the US. Does that suggest that they're willing to bring kind of economic packages or convince companies to come and invest here? Why do you think they're kind of upping the ante on their publicity around Northern Ireland? It
could be, obviously, we're going into the next presidential election cycle.
Everything's about votes.
The Americans do everything it's basically 2 years, and off you go. There's the next you're running for office again. As I said, it's back to the Good Friday Agreement again. That was obviously the Americans had a huge involvement in that. The Democrats obviously want to sell that. Maybe Joe Biden thinks that he can maybe get his own legacy in Northern Ireland by helping to try and bring forward some type of agreement, I think. And obviously, yes, there will be a strategic interest in getting him over and maybe getting more economic investors, maybe getting more people to invest in Northern Ireland. To go back to what I said about the Good Friday Agreement, though, I don't think that investment really has brought prosperity to the country. I think relying on that entirely is the problem, really, that we're basically relying on all this American money. I don't think his appearance is... I don't think he'll come unless there's a deal. I don't think he will only come if the Assembly is going to come back, if the DUP are going to go into government. I don't see him coming in that stage. Some people have suggested that he could come and try and broker some type of agreement. I mean, that's not going to happen, but given that Joe Biden, unionists don't like Joe Biden, he's always been very much on the Republican Nationalist Alliance side of this debate. He's not seen as being sympathetic to the unionist concerns. So I don't think his appearance at all will help in any way.
No sleep will be lost.
No sleep will be lost.
I mean, is the anniversary a time for a bit of a stock take, though? Because as we've been talking over the last few minutes, there are things that people might have expected the Belfast Good Friday Agreement to deliver that it hasn't. There were a number of changes made at St Andrews and other places to some of the things. I mean, is it a time to actually, in the political vacuum, to actually say, well, what are the things that we're disappointed at? What are the things that we'd actually like to change going forward? I mean, the whole kind of stuff around designation, we're getting to this awkward point where the other designation in the middle between unionist and nationalist is actually getting to a size where it's actually getting cut out of some decision making in the sense that it has votes, but it doesn't actually matter, particularly if you're in a petition of concern or something, or one of the votes that just requires two communities to both be there. So do you think it's nearly an accidental good time for a stock take?
I think it is a good time for stock take. We have that recent headline in the Belfast Telegraph about unionist support for the agreement has fallen, which doesn't surprise me at all. Maybe we'll talk about that in detail maybe later on. But I think in general, I think people are very frustrated with the arrangements in very different ways. I would say I don't think it's across the board, but I do think it is time for a review. There's a review clause in the agreement itself and in the legislation. We need to look at our system of government. As you say, it really caters for nationalists and unionists. They've got this other designation. It doesn't cater for them. The concept of mandatory coalition, I think, is just, we've had so many years of disrupted government. We need to change this, that we can't have this ever again, that one party cannot just collapse the system and leave Northern Ireland without any type of government. I think we need to look at everything, really. The public are coming to a stage where I think, as I said, people are losing faith in this. People are going, not in total the agreement in itself, but are just going, these institutions are not working. We need to fix this. So I think better time than any to sit down and say what have we done well, what have we not done well, and certainly the fact that so many people in Northern Ireland feel like they haven't benefited from the agreement. They don't have the money in their pocket. They don't have the life that they wanted for their children. This is a better time than any to look at that and think, what can we do better?
Though while we go through all of this kind of commemorating, perhaps rather than celebrating, we're also kind of in the middle of what will become the local election campaign. And I kind of wonder, as we look towards it, was going to be May the 4th, now it's going to be May the 18th. English local elections are still going ahead on the 4th. They seem to be able to count it on the 5th before the coronation on the 6th. But it definitely wouldn't be the case. It takes at least 2 days to get kind of some of the bigger councils counted here. So it'll be the 18th. But, I mean, what do you think will be the campaign issues as we look forward to, if we do look forward to another election campaign?
Gosh. Well, I mean, in an ideal world, the electorate would be going into the ballot box to vote on things like rates. So, the rates increase is a big thing at the moment, where they're proposing to put the rates up. I think it's 7%, 8% or something like that.
Well, yeah, so the earliest ones that have come out looks like that, and it looks like every council will have to do something.
Well, yeah, we'll have to do something. But I mean, most people I speak to are like, well, what am I paying for?
Yeah.
If the rates go up, that means certain people's rent is going to go up, and people's household bills are going to go up, and at the time people are already squeezed. A lot of people are like, what am I paying for? And I'm already paying a very high amount of rates, and I can't even, get the bins collected on time for various issues because they're not paying the council workers enough. At this time to put a rate increase really, I think, will annoy a lot of people, and you'd like to think that people will go to the ballot box on that issue. But you look at the political parties and the positions that they're taking, some of them are being like, well, we do actually have to raise the rates. We need the extra money than the extra cash. But I think when it comes down to it, I think it will be protocol issues. I think it will be around identity politics. I think those issues will dominate. Obviously, there's local factors. People, I think, will vote for councillors that are very good or very active on the ground. I mean, councillors like Paul McCusker, things like that, will get their vote out, absolutely. But I think it will be, the narrative of this local election will be around the assembly, will be around the protocol, will be around those bigger, wider issues, and about Alliance and their growth and the DUP and the TEV.
Yeah, so kind of you say alliance, because if you look back at the previous local government election, and this is through the benefit of hindsight, which, but I mean, there's a huge kind of increase. I mean, they went from 32 seats to 53 at the back in 2019, which was kind of nearly the beginning of the alliance surge in a sense. The people didn't quite believe that they were surprised nearly when it happened at the next election that it continued, but the seeds were there. I mean, they were running. I was kind of putting the stats into a spreadsheet recently, getting ahead for the boring nerd counts of this. But I mean, there were alliance candidates who had nearly 2 quotas of first preferences, and they had nobody to transfer it to. They had 1.5, 1.6 quotas, so they could have had loads of extra councillors back in 2019 if they'd actually had the candidates, if they'd had the belief in themselves. But also, this time it feels like, kind of Sinn Féin did very well in the last Assembly election by saying, vote for us, we want to be the biggest party, not just the biggest party of nationalism, but the biggest party overall, and they achieved that. There's quite a chance actually they could do it this time. I can kind of see John Finucane getting his kind of election guru campaign manager board out and saying, well, actually make us the biggest party in local councils as well, because the DUP are ahead, but not by that much, and it doesn't take a lot of switch. That could be diabolical for the SDLP if there was a shift within nationalism to get them over the line to be first again. Yeah,
I think the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists really in this local election are going to be hoping that they make some gains to show after a couple of years of not really having a very mixed bag, very bad bag in some cases. But yeah, absolutely, I could see Sinn Féin going out to the local electorate and saying, let's send another message here. Let's get more people from the party in councils. Let's send the message. They're not going to deny us our right to office, that they're not going to deny us a right to government. And I could see a lot of people going for that. And as you say, the SDLP then has to find a position somewhere in the middle of that as to how they benefit or how they fit their way into that. So absolutely, I could see Sinn Féin doing very well out of this. But equally, as I said, I think if the DUP could get their base out too, and could say to people, let's send them another message, get the DUP on councils, this is the attitude, so this is what we'll do, and people will go out and vote for them. So I think it's going to be interesting, and I think especially if we have another Assembly election, it's been kicked into the can again, but if we have another Assembly election, I think the locals will be seen as a mood tester, but to know where the electorate are at.
And as always, any election can be a proxy for some other question or some other election that's coming, and we kind of live in the cycle of this. I mean, one of the problems with the rates increases is that they could go up even further except councils will probably have to make some cuts to services.
Yeah,
We have the police recently kind of saying there'll be fewer people in certain roles because they don't have the funding and they don't have the some of what was promised, maybe a new decade, new approach, hasn't kind of happened. All kinds of areas are kind of under stress. Rishi Sunak has kind of said he's going to kind of making health a bit of a priority. There's £1 billion being put towards some kind of waiting lists and accident and emergency and things. I wonder whether that's new money or whether that's just reallocated money. If it's new money, Northern Ireland will get some extra cash in the as well to spend. But we're kind of going to live in the next probably decade, at least 5-10 years, of a kind of an austerity, aren't we, with cuts to services?
I don't think we should accept that as an inevitability. We did that 10 years ago where people were told we have to have austerity, we have no other choice, we have to make cuts. No, we didn't. It was a political move to do that. We do not have to accept further cuts to our public services but paying more at the same time. We just don't have to do it. You know, the government can borrow money and spend it. Obviously, thanks to Liz Truss now, it's more expensive for the government to borrow money, but we don't need to accept that this is the reality that we have to live with. We don't need to live with another 10 years of more people sliding into poverty and deprivation. The UK government can borrow, as I said, the government can take action, it can implement policy changes to put more money back in people's pockets. We can have structural changes within Northern Ireland to change our public services, we can increase people's pay, we can do all these things, we don't have to accept it at all.
But can we do any of those things if we don't have an executive that is local people elected to deal with local issues?
It certainly makes it challenging, and certainly I think we need to get the Tories out of office, I think, to make things a hell of a lot easier, but we need to, better things are possible, and I think we all need to, we need to accept that. We don't need to just swallow this. As you say, paying more for our rates, but we're going to cut the public services. Well, I mean, what are we paying for? What are the public... How is this country supposed to function any further? We have assets stripped this place to the bone. People are suffering. People, in my work, you know, people were ringing us every day, suffering. It makes me despair to think that we could end up with another 10 years of this. And I think this country will be run into the ground if we do. And for anybody that cares about this country and cares about the union, we do not need this at all. We need something better.
It's a bit of a handbrake turn, but I mean, quite recently there was a kind of a play by Louise Matthews that Kibosh put on, not on our watch. It was looking at the Belfast used to have Northern Ireland's only dedicated women's hostel, the Regina Celli's house in West Belfast, and it closed under kind of difficult circumstances in terms of how that closure happened. There was a promise at that stage. The workers had a work-in for 12 weeks. Some of the staff basically just lived and worked in the place to kind of keep it open for the remaining residents, and that only ended at the time when the Department for Communities actually said, well, in 2 months' time we will open 2 hostels that will be better and there will be extra funding for this. And at that point the workers said, okay, this is an improvement, we'll go. Only one of those hostels opened, and it only opens overnight, so it's actually providing less than at the time. And it's kind of another one of those examples of kind of departments promising things that they can't deliver, and it's probably another example of local policy where women are kind of deprioritised from kind of spending. And as I saw the kind of play recently, it made me think of, this is just one example, a particularly hurtful one, but one of many where not having ministers really affects. A minister can put a bit of pressure on a department, on the civil servants to do things, to spend money in a particular way, but actually on lots of issues that's not happening. Civil servants will be keeping the place running, the lights are still on, so they're doing a good job, thank you very much, but it's not as good as actually having a bit of political direction and having a bit of doing policies that actually people want to see implemented.
Having civil servants in office is not acceptable, and it's not, you're right, it's not as good as having an assembly and having ministers in office who can take decisions and policy decisions. Yes, obviously the assembly has limited powers in certain respects, and obviously it is Westminster in theory that can do these things, but at this time when things are we're in a crisis, really, people have the right to elected government. They have the right, they should know. They should have an elected representative who's willing to go to government and advocate for them, even if the chamber can't do anything. The fact that you have somebody there who's speaking up for you means something. It means something. It's better than having nobody and them saying, "Oh well, sorry, we can't do anything." It's just not good enough. As you said, there are so many decisions that are being pushed. Having a really, really good minister in place makes all the difference. You see that in housing policy, for instance. Deirdre Hargey, I thought was quite a good minister for communities. She implemented the policies during COVID that were just absolutely fantastic. And if she hadn't been there, who knows what decisions may have been taken at that time. So it's so frustrating. I think, just as you say, Regina Kelly is a fine example of that these decisions are being left. The health service is an absolute state. It is just absolutely atrocious at this point in time, and having a health minister there, even if they were just chipping away at it, making incremental changes, is better than having nothing. And we saw when Sinn Féin collapsed the Assembly 3 years ago, the health service took a further dip. It is now taken an even further dip, if it can even go even further, even possible than that. So we're really in a desperate situation at the moment. We need the Assembly back ASAP. As I say, some people, be realistic about what the Assembly can do, but as I said, people should have an MLA up there speaking up on their behalf. This just isn't good enough.
So Sinn Féin collapsed the Assembly and the Executive for 3 years. We kind of learned some lessons from that. The DUP have now collapsed the place for a year, and we are we in Groundhog Day? Do you have hope, Sarah, as you look forward? We're kind of 1 month through the year. We've got another 11 to go. Is there any happiness politically in terms of how this place will be managed and how Northern Ireland will work over the next 11 months? I'm
in my cynical era. So I'm very much I really don't see it coming back anytime soon. Based on the information I have on this date where we're filming this, who knows what could happen in the months ahead, but the protocol is the issue, and the DUP seem prepared to hold out on this. I don't see them getting what they want at this stage. Barring a situation where Westminster maybe steps in and changes the rules, I don't see the Assembly returning really, and the question then becomes, well then, do we need to actually sit down and work something else out? Do all the parties need to get together and actually work out a different agreement at this stage, agree some reforms and go back into government? But that in itself is problematic because obviously, talking about mandatory coalition, Sinn Féin, quite understandably to be fair, are a bit wary of doing away with mandatory coalition. Even the DUP now, I think Peter Robinson had written in the newsletter a couple of months ago about how the unionists shouldn't give up joint government. Understand why he took that position as well, but given that unionists are starting to become a minority. There's real issues at hand here, and it does depress me that we could have reform of the institutions at a time when we just got our first nationalist First Minister designate. The institutions should be changed for the better because it's the right thing to do, and it depresses me a bit that it might happen because this has happened because we've got a Sinn Féin First Minister, and so people have gone, oh no, sorry, suddenly the system doesn't work for us, so let's just chuck it out the window. Michelle O'Neill should be the First Minister at this point in time, and Jeffrey, I suppose Jeffrey's in Westminster. The DUP should be in the deputy position, and we should be getting on with the business of government. It should work as it is, but it doesn't. But I think, we're at the point where it needs to change. Watch this space, but don't hold your breath. That's it for this episode of Slugger TV. David McCann will be back in the hot seat at the end of the month with a special edition coming from the Look North Festival, where he'll be talking to some of the political heavyweights in the North Belfast constituency. Check out details of where you can get a ticket if you want to be in the audience for that at the looknorthfestival.com website. Until then, from Sarah and from me, goodbye.